Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Any questions or any remarks, observations, please? Wa alaikum salam.
I was trying to ask a few questions. I just applied for become a regular text.
Yes.
And I have done some reading before painting. I just have a few questions to ask. They make me...
Are you can try? Please. Just go like this. Yes, go ahead, please.
They make me slightly basic, but I hope you forgive me because I haven't asked these type of questions before. My first one is about the topic. The question is that there have been many topics in the past that have come down to the people, and Muhammad is speaking to the topic. But the people who are more than any topic are totally others, unbelieving before them. The question is, would they still come to the needy parts of the world to help people? No, we need to help.
If you understand the question partly, because we believe that Muhammad is the seal of the Prophet and the last law-bringing Prophet, what would happen then? What was it?
He says the prophets who are coming after him, will they come to the needy parts of the world?
Needy part?
Where they are needed, or will they just appear?
Yes, I'll explain. I have in fact already explained this aspect of the question. It's a question which covers a lot of interesting areas of investigation. But this particular part has been repeatedly answered by me. When you think of a subordinate prophet having come to deputize Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, then you must keep in mind that it is for the first time in the world that someone has come to follow and to deputize a prophet for the entire world. Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not a prophet for a limited area or a limited people. He was a prophet for the entire world. So anyone who comes to deputize him for the entire world, he is the only person capable of receiving the name of a subordinate prophet. Because here, in this context, prophethood has gained a much wider perspective and application. Now prophethood doesn't mean prophet of Israel, prophet of India, prophet of China. It means prophet for the whole mankind. So how can one be befittingly called deputy to Huzur Akram Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and yet only be a original prophet? His case would be quite similar to the prophets of Israel or prophets of other chains of prophets, but not at all to the prophethood of Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So if he is a prophet, he has to be for the whole world. And if he is a regional reformer or a temporary reformer, then he cannot be called a subordinate prophet. This is exactly what has happened. All the Mujaddideen who came before Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salatu wasalam, they were very great men indeed. In their own regions, they performed such miracles as early prophets of Israel could not in their own time and in their own region. Yet because the standard of prophethood, the concept of prophethood had widened much more than before, so they could not be called prophets. Because now prophethood had to be understood with reference to the master prophet, Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. This is the reason why either it has to be a prophet who is not regional and addresses the whole world, or he could not be called a prophet, he would only be a mujaddid. So mujaddid is the term which before the time of Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam was called a prophet. And in this context, prophet is a term which appeared for the first time in history. If prophet means a global prophet. Hope you understand the question, or do you have some more to say in this regard, please? And could you speak closer to the microphone? Because the sound level is very delicately poised here. If you raise the sound level a wee little bit, it would start noises like it does now. And if you lower it, then it doesn't become audible at all, doesn't remain audible at all. But anyways, I have appointed someone with his ears glued to the loudspeaker. So please start, once again, please start saying what you want to say, please.
If you can't tell them just to speak up a little bit louder, that's all.
No, but why don't you raise this machine? Why can't machine speak, transfer the voice louder?
The wire is coming too far apart. That's
No, this can happen. This is not acceptable. Yes, please.
Listening to your case in the past, prophets have always been persecuted by the people to whom they give the message. Does that make it inevitable in the future for prophets to be persecuted each time they come down with a message?
prophets in the past have been persecuted. Has it some sort of regular feature that any prophet that ever will come will be persecuted?
Yes, all prophets are persecuted. So was Hazrat Masih Maud Salam and his followers. Everyone has been persecuted. And it's a phenomena which is sunnatullah. I mean, this is a way of God in which you will never find a change. You know, it's highly important too. Of course they suffer for that persecution, but the advantages are overwhelming. They offset all the disadvantages of suffering. If, for instance, you visualize a prophet who had come and who was immediately met with glorious reception, and people would shower petals on him and give him a red carpet treatment. If this is what happens to prophets, then all the big liars, all the big rascals of the world would begin to claim prophethood, because the liars and the mean earthly people always run for easy benefits, easy roads to success. And there won't be any criterion left for the prophet, the truth of the prophet, which is not easy for anyone to attain. But if prophethood must walk through the passage of fire and torture and persecution and abuse and everything that man can think of tormenting others, if that is all that is used against prophets, if that is the path of prophethood, it would be either madmen or true prophets who would claim to be prophets. And this is why exactly we find in history of prophets that either they are accepted or they are called madmen. So prophethood is not an easy thing. It's not made easy by God, and it's for the sake of truth itself. So all those who follow the prophets in the beginning, they also are treated in the same manner, and they also have to tread the path of torture and persecution. And again with the same brilliant results. Only the truthful people who are the very cream of the society as far as the piety is concerned, they can dare do that. So a polarization is set in that society. A positive pole is created and a negative pole is created. All that is good and worthy, that begins to be attractive towards the positive pole. But there is a very painful sifting in the way. And all that is unworthy and is the scum of the thing, of the earth, they begin to shift to the more easy, more accessible and more profitable, as they say it, path, and begin to gather round the negative circle. This is the most scientific phenomena. Nobody can think of a better scheme than as we find it. It is painful, we know. We are passing through that period ourselves. But at the same time, we are reminded by the Holy Quran that Asa an takrahu shay'an wa huwa khairul lakum. Of course there are things which are very painful to you, which you abhor, but in the ultimate analysis they are much better for you. So Allah has to prescribe these things to you. So the prophethood transfers the same thing to the followers of the prophethood, and it's highly essential for the purification of the society and the ultimate victory of not our people but our values. Yes, please, your third question. Lady from Bromley, please, your third question.
My other question was about the role of women in Islamic society. How does Islam reconcile differences which exist between one's religion and one's culture? Say, if you come from India and you're a Muslim, or say you an Indian Muslim who's a Muslim, how do you reconcile the differences between culture and religion?
My interpreter, please.
How do you reconcile between a culture and religion, and what is the role of a woman in these changing circumstances?
And your question, as I have been made to understand, is that what is the difference between culture and religion, and what should a lady do in such circumstances? Now, the first part is obvious and very clear, but the second part I couldn't follow, unless you mean that what should a lady do if her culture demands different things from her, different behavior, and her religion demands a different behavior. Is that what you wanted to ask, or is it something else? First, you please make your question clear.
Well, what I'm specifically referring to is the program itself. You may say that a woman is observing photos in the Western society, but this may not be accepted so. Say, back in Pakistan or elsewhere where Islam is most prevalent.
So it amounts to the same thing as I explained, that if there is a clash in religious values and cultural values, what should a person do? Here the question should not be limited to ladies alone. Any person, who be him a male or be she a lady, if she finds him or herself in such a difficult situation, then what should they do? Now, first of all, difference between religion and culture. Religion is a course of conduct prescribed for man by a higher being, that is God. Now, this is the definition as we understand as a Muslim. And also the Christians and the Jews agree to this definition. In other parts of the world, in other religions, this definition has to be widened a bit because there is no question of one God there, many deities maybe, or some other concepts. So the definition would be anything, any course or conduct which is prescribed to him by saintly people, by people on earth who have their contact with deities, or by such people who are saintly in their behavior, but they do not establish any contact with any outside deity, yet they are wise, so wise that they hold the position of dictating things to other people. And because their teachings, the course they prescribe pertains to moral values and the subject of morality of man, so this is a religion. Now I am widening this definition in view of the Hindus and the Buddhists. And all the religions similar to them also are contained in this definition. Those who believe in deities, they don't believe that those deities have definitely set a course for mankind. And they don't have a definite teachings from certain deities. But the whole thing is confused. In some places you find saints speaking of deities' goodwill and wishes. And sometimes some saints refer to certain deity which has spoken to them. And some just speak from themselves and say that if you do this, you will be saved, if you don't do this, you will go to hell, or this and that. So these are also religions. And Buddhism, which is an atheist religion, yet is called religion because they believe that this course of behavior has come from a very wise source, that is Buddha. The very spring of wisdom has been tapped to prescribe this conduct for man. And because it pertains to morality and ultimate happiness of mankind, so this should be termed a religion. As against this, culture has no such roots, no such context whatsoever, which make culture binding on the people as far as morality goes. Culture and religion may have some common ground occasionally. Many cultural heritages which we find today in different parts of the world are in fact related to the religions of those respective regions. And no culture can be found completely divorced and separated from the religion of that area or those people. Yet culture is not a moral must. Culture does not deal with crime and punishment. Culture does not deal with deeds of good acts and rewards. Culture is a set value which is reward in itself or a punishment in itself. If you follow the cultural values of a people, therefore your attraction and for making you appear one of the people. If you adopt that mode, that way of life, it has nothing to do with your moral uplift or with the life to come. That only relates to your closeness to a certain people or your being apart from a certain people. this culture can be adopted without interference with your religion, or sometimes at the cost of your religion. Generally speaking, the best formula for a culture is given in this English saying that when in Rome, do as Romans do. Now this is cultural advice. A Britisher, if he goes to Rome and starts doing as Romans do, he is not violating any British rules, nor any Christian rules, neither politically, nor culturally, nor in any other respect. What he is doing is that he wants to identify himself with the sea of people around him. And that identification can be done through culture, through adopting that culture. Unless you are culturally the same, unless those barriers, which are cultural barriers, are removed, those people who come and settle in a country, and even if they get naturalized and get the nationality of that nation, that people, they still remain aloof. They remain apart, mainly because of these cultural gaps. And most of the racial hatreds which we find in some regions, they also spring from these cultural gaps. So culture is different and religion is different. In culture, many a time you can adopt a culture without sacrificing your religion. But occasionally it so happens, and particularly it so happens with Islam, that most of the cultures as found in the world today do not entirely agree with Islamic values. So there has to be a separation at some place. And this is why the fundamental rule for accepting a religion is that you must give precedence to religion over every other value. This is what has been laid very clear in the Holy Quran in so many places. And also this is exactly what has been included in the conditions of Bai'at, that is initiation, by Hazrat Masih Maud alayhi salatu wassalam. मैं दीन को दुनिया पर मुकद्दम रखूंगा. I will always give preference to religion over worldly affairs. So thus when we define the relationship between religion and culture, like I have done, then the second part of your question automatically drops out. Always, every time, when you find yourself on the crossroad and you have to decide between culture or religion, and you cannot reconcile one with the other without damaging the other, then the only course prescribed by religion to you is follow religion and sacrifice cultural values, and be ready to go through any punishment if the society meets punishment out to you. Now, with parda, observation of parda or anything else, whatever you may call it, for instance, it's not the ladies only who are put on trial, it is men also who are always on trial in different cultural values. Here in England, they go for dancing, drinking, clubs and things which always invite you in the name of culture towards things which are declared evil in the Holy Quran. Gambling, and when you don't mix up with them in all these departments, then you become aloof. Even if you are British national, you are no longer British because there are cultural differences. So you have to accept it. and accept it in a manner that through propagation you win over that society and assimilate it into Islamic culture. So when I said Islamic culture, a new factor has got introduced now in our discussion. Previously we were only speaking of religion and culture as two different things, having different spheres, occasionally meeting in certain spheres. But now when I speak of Islamic culture, what I mean to say is this, that Islam has spoken so much on everyday life that no other religion has spoken so much. And looking at it from this angle, you may declare it to be a very demanding religion. So demanding that it turns life into a sort of imprisonment. Now this is not sarcasm. This is in reality what it is. This is exactly what Hazrat Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam has declared it to be, where he says, "Ad-dunya sijnul lil mu'mini wa jannatul lil kafir." This world is a prison for believers and a heaven for the non-believers. So that heaven lies in their different cultural values. And this imprisonment is the imprisonment of Sharia. So inside the prison there is also a sort of culture. And outside the prison there is also a sort of culture. Now what are the fundamental differences in Islamic culture and the non-Islamic culture? The fundamental differences, of course there are so many differences, but I am only going to make it clear to you that despite the fact that Islam is a religion, it also has a sort of culture. And in fact every culture, as I had earlier mentioned, is colored by some religion. Though it gets divorced in the passage of time and acquires an independent identity. But looking back again at the question of culture, if you begin to study it from this angle, you will immediately recognize the effect of religion on cultures. Now here, for instance, in the Western society, the Jewish are as much Western as any other people are, the Jewish people, yet there is a marked difference between the culture of the Jews and the culture of the Christians. Indian culture is a so-called Indian culture, but it is not just one culture. The Muslim way of life there was different, and the Hindu way of life there was different, and the Buddhist way of life was different from the Hindu way of life. And all these three people, as far as the nationality went, were Indians, yet their cultures were different. And again, the Hindu culture was not just one single culture. Culture is a very delicate mixing up of certain religious values with certain local values, and that mending produces a culture which comes into its own and becomes an independent way of life. So Hinduism, wherever it got wed to local cultures, in the south it acquired a different culture. When it got wed to the cultures in north of India, and so in the east and west, it became different cultures, yet all had the same Hindu features in those cultures. This is exactly what has happened in the case of Islam. When we speak of Islamic culture, it is a very misleading word if you don't apply it to various regions where Muslims are found and then further analyze the situation. Otherwise you will remain completely confused. When we speak of Islamic culture, that is different in Indonesia from that found in Arabia, and very different in India and in Pakistan than found elsewhere, and different in south of India and north of India and east of India and west of India. Bengali culture, for instance, I have been there many a time while Bangladesh had not yet come into being. It was East Pakistan in those days. Now we have a Muslim culture in West Pakistan, and they also had a Muslim culture in East Pakistan, as it was called then. But the values were so different that a Bengali felt a Hindu closer to them in cultural values than a West Pakistani, a Punjabi for instance. So, yet there was a difference between Hindu Bengali culture and Muslim Bengali culture too. There were certain features. Now what are those features which may make a culture appear religious in certain aspects, and where you can find a common thread of religion? Those are the features which in a religion have no compromise with other values. There are religious rites which cannot be compromised, and those rites, when they enter a culture, got mixed with culture, they give that clear coloring of the religion to that culture. Hindus have their rites of worship and other religious obligations and things, which they will always maintain, whether they are in Bengal or in Gujarat or in North India or wherever they are. So these are the values which will not be compromised. Those uncompromising values form the basic structure of a culture which has many other values, and wherever there is a mixture, these two features have to be taken into account separately. So Islam has some values of no compromise. Those values are, for instance, its demand on human beings in the direction of God and in the direction of mankind. Demands which are imperative, which you can never afford to leave or ignore. For instance, 5 times worship. For instance, being pure, not only hygienically, but as we call it, being pak or not pak. It has nothing to do with hygiene. It is something of a religious value added to your purity and your cleanliness. And to have bath after in certain situations, and to wash your mouth before you, or take full ablution before you go to the prayer. And whenever you attend the call of nature, you must wash yourself as prescribed with water, not with just any cloth or anything. So all these are religious do's or not do's, do not do's.
Don'ts.
Don'ts, religious do's or do nots, which must be observed meticulously by a Muslim. So whenever these features and many other such features which are made obligatory in every Muslim's life, and which he comes across almost daily, it becomes a routine of his life, they will always be found intermixed with Muslim cultures, whatever those cultures be. Now, segregation of sexes is a fundamental part of Muslim culture. It has no compromise. How you observe it, there might be some cushioning, some difference of opinion, some slight compromises. But segregation in itself is a fundamental order. And this segregation order can never be accepted by the present day Western culture, Western culture. Even if you don't observe parda with a burqa as it is observed in Pakistan, yet segregation you will have to follow. And at every step you will find difficulties as you are presenting just only in the form of parda. A man would extend his hand for you to shake hand. He would like you to join him for a cup of wine or something, or he would invite you to a dancing floor, and many other situations would arise. Come on, let's go joyride and things. How can you cooperate with them for the sake of a culture, for the sake of not offending such people, if you have to sacrifice your religion? So it is not just parda to be taken aloof as a single value. Even if you give in here, how can you give in at every step? If you give in at every step, then nothing would be left to you. That is of Islam. Only a Western acquired culture would be the net result. These small things, I mean, if you call it a small thing, appear to be small in their own limited sphere, but in totality they play a very important role. To make what I want to say more clear, I can illustrate it with a joke. It is a joke, but it's ideally applicable on this situation. Somebody went for tattoo. He asked the person who was the expert to make a lion's picture by tattooing on his arm. So when he pricked him with the needle, he felt pain, and he was rather jerked out. What do you say?
Shuddered.
No. I have a different word in mind. Anyway, that has missed me. Anyway, when he felt the first prick, he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, you asked me to make a lion, I am doing that." He said, "But what are you making now, this moment?" He said, "I was starting with the eye." He said, can't a lion be complete without an eye?" He said, "Yes, of course. A lion can, will he not be a lion without an eye?" He said, "Yes, he would remain a lion without an eye." He said, "All right, don't make the eye, make something else." So he pricked him again. He said, "What this time?" He said, "This is a left eye now. Previously it was a right eye." He said, "Can't there be blind lions?" He said, "Yes, of course there are blind lions." He said, "Oh, make a blind lion this time." So he went to prick again, and this time it was the right ear, and he said, "Of course lions can be without ears." Yes. And then came the turn of legs and other parts of the body. And each single part was declared not to be essential by the one who was tattooing. And he said, "Yes, you can do without it, a lion can be without it." So he got up without a lion. So if you begin to behave this way to a religion, by declaring a small point without which a religion can be complete, it would not only be a small point, it would be a train, a procession of small points, which would ultimately take away the entire values of religion, and what would you be left with would be just a simple culture. Fourth question, if any, please, if there is a fourth question. Pan? thank you. No more tutoring. Yes, please, any questions from the men's side now?
So last Saturday, you were asked a question about the morality and absolute morality. And then it so happened that some question was asked from the Switzerland, and you so beautifully related everything with the absolute religion and absolute morality. And it seems to me that it was a new subject which you have really enlightened us. Would you really continue? Because that was left halfway.
Was it?
Yes. And this
So where it was
subject,
left, you pick up the thread from there and I'll start answering the questions from there on.
no, if I will go back, that will be not justice to you, sir. But I want you, whatever you feel, say.
No, but I think it will be justice to you if you go back. And I want to do justice to you.
Relating the morality to every situation which occurs in the world now, because it seems to me that the cure for everything nowadays is the absolute morality.
Exactly, that is correct.
And this subject requires really to be discussed more.
Yes, in its applications are so wide that if you begin to illustrate, there will be no end to this discussion. So this is why I just gave you the fundamentals
That's right.
and gave you a sort of key which can unlock many locks if you apply this key which is provided to us by Islam. Absolute morality is a very important thing. Unless you define morality as an absolute value, you can never create an atmosphere of peace in any region. That is what I said.
That's right, sir.
And that is what I mean. And I am speaking from not just from theory, but I know I have applied this to every situation and I have always come out with the same answer. That absolute morality, in fact, controls and governs every situation in the world in which human life has any interest. And this is, as I mentioned there, in my opinion, absolute wisdom. Absolute wisdom and absolute morality are one and the same thing. And without wisdom you cannot save mankind. Al-Hikmah, which is perhaps called Buddha in Buddhism, Buddhi or Buddha, yes, they are close to it but not entirely, because that book was a much earlier book, as we believe it was revealed by the Buddhist teachings. I mean, that was revealed by God to Buddha and he was a messenger of God. But later on people corrupted their teachings and also distorted their own history. In fact, it had to be like this because in those days, first of all, he came about 500 years or more earlier than Hazrat Masih. So that is about 2,500 years almost. And some people say more than that. They put the age between 500 and 1,000 years earlier than Hazrat Masih. Some say it is 600, but let's see. That is a very, very long distance as far as the human annals are concerned. Records, historical records are concerned. And particularly it's a very long period in that region of India where, or Nepal, I mean that region of the east where Hazrat Buddha came. Because they, in the first 500 years, they did not keep any written records of his sayings and things. So Buddha, as we understand, as we believe, was a messenger of God. but his teaching was not as perfect as the teachings of the Holy Quran, because it was the final consummate teaching for the whole mankind. Yet it has that light and beauty of truth in it. And ultimately in Buddhism also this is accepted, that morality and wisdom are one and the same thing. Instead, they don't call it morality at all. There is no morality in Buddhism. All that is wisdom. So absolute morality is absolute wisdom, according to me, as I have understood the Holy Quran. And the Holy Quran gives absolute morality. This is why the Holy Quran defines those with wisdom in connection with their godlyhood, or with their God-fearing standard or quality. A man who is without God, who has not relationship with God, cannot be wise. A wise man is the one who has his relationship with God. This is the definition of the wise man according to the Holy Quran. For instance, in the verses so often recited in the Ahmadiyya mosques, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. There are signs for the wise people. Now the things described before this, the wise people, have apparently nothing to do with religion. They are scientific observations. فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, in the creation of heaven and earth. وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ, and the changes of days and nights. لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, signs for the wise people. Now one immediately begins to think that the following verse would lead to scientific discoveries. There are such wise people who understand the phenomena of nature and things, but it suddenly makes a somersault. And the definition of these wise people is not those who understand the phenomena of day and night, the phenomena of creation. الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِمْ. The wise people are those who day and night remember Allah. يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا, standing and sitting, day and night. And the conclusion they draw from the observation of all this is مَا رَبَّنَا مَا خَلَقْتَ هَذَا بَاطِلًا. So it is again wedded to the same observation, that the wise people are those who draw correct conclusions and inferences from what they observe, and they look for the ultimate goodness of themselves, not temporary gains. Wise people are those who have their contact with their Lord and work according to the dictates of their Lord. Whatever He teaches them, they follow. With the result that when they observe the whole phenomena of nature, they come to the same conclusion with greater force and strength, that all this has not been created without purpose, without a goal. So if it has a purpose and a goal beyond us, then that is more important than to just make benefit out of the temporary gains we can have from our contact with nature. And their concept of their relationship with the nature is much wider than the concept of relationship with nature of ordinary materialistic people. When they think and ponder over creation, over the phenomena of day and night and change, that is what is meant. The phenomena of change, of life entering death and death entering life. When they ponder over this, the worldly materialistic people make things to make life easier here. And there is no question of morality. No question of morality. Everything is related to their temporary gains. Now, those people are not called wise by Allah. The wise are those who, when study the phenomena of nature, their attention is drawn to their Lord and the Creator, and they find a design in the whole thing. A design which expects them to live in a certain manner so that after death they live in a better way. They go for lasting values rather than temporary values. And they want to please the maker of the design rather than to love design itself. When they enter this realm of conduct and thinking and philosophy, immediately their conduct begins to differ from, and their approach towards life begins to differ from the rest of the people on earth. Now that way of life which they receive from their Lord, that is morality. Ultimately, morality in itself is to be defined as religious conduct. As we see morality, there is no better definition than religious conduct. The importance of religious conduct dawns upon the wise men. And who are the wise men? Not those who study the phenomena of nature as itself, but they study the phenomena of nature as in contact with the Creator. This is wisdom. And this is also morality according to them. Otherwise they wouldn't say, Rabbana ma khalaqta hadha batila, subhanaka faqina azab an-nar, and the rest of the prayer which follows. Now this is a very interesting distinction between the wise men of as they are called in the world, and the wise men as they are declared wise in the Holy Quran. One wisdom is wed to morality, and the other wisdom is wed to immorality. That is where they stand apart and distinctly apart from each other. How this? I'll explain. In the one case, when you study the phenomena of nature, your attention is drawn to the Creator. And in other case, when you study the phenomena of nature, your attention is drawn to yourself, to your end of the creation. How must the creation serve us best? And how must the creation be molded to our needs? As if the creation was entirely to please them and for nothing else. If that is the attitude, if you enter a house and you forget about the builder and his purpose, then you find it as your property, for instance. You will never think of the purposes of the builder. You will always think of how it suits you best. This is why different people make different uses of the houses. I have seen certain beautiful houses built in Qadian by highly educated people who had some drawing rooms and dining rooms and things. When we went to visit those houses, they were now at that time occupied by people of much lower culture. So in the drawing rooms we saw asses and donkeys and horses and things, and in the dining rooms we saw storage for cotton and things like that. The same house. But there the people didn't know the purpose of the builder, nor were they find themselves obliged to follow that purpose. What they thought was this was built for our convenience, and we must follow that convenience, and we must mold the house to our convenience, even if it appears ugly and most unsuitable, yet it should be converted to our convenience. So their wisdom now begins to play havoc with the house. according to their own requirements. There is no adaptation. There is adaptation in the sense they adopt the house and change it to their own requirements. They don't adapt themselves to the requirements of the house. That is the requirements of the builder. So the conduct is extremely different in both these cases. Now this is a very, very simple illustration. Just to make things easy for you to understand what I want to convey to you. When you look at the creation of nature, the whole phenomena of creation and the change and the phenomena of life and death and everything, it is so immense that unless you understand the purpose of the Creator, you will not be able to have the right equation with the nature or with whatever is created. How can you find that right relationship without knowing the purpose of the Creator? So those are the wise men, according to the Quran, which observe nature and creation in respect of its Creator, their Creator, and not in respect of how best they can make use of what they find. And those who try to make use of creation as best as they can, they are declared as sufaha in the Holy Quran. Stupid people. Because ultimately they are going to suffer. So when you turn to God for giving you a way of life, a conduct of and a code of conduct in coming into relationship with the nature, dead or alive, with human beings or beasts, then you are given a teachings. And if that teaching is for the ultimate goodness of mankind, and if that teachings requires some sacrifices here and there for the sake of ultimate goodness, this is exactly what morality is. No difference. So in the ultimate finest analysis of morality, you reach morality through wisdom. And if you follow morality, it would always lead you to religion. This is a point which is very delicate, yet I was surprised to see that Lenin was intelligent enough to understand this point. When I read him on this subject, I was really surprised. And I, as they call it, to lift one's hats off to you. That was the feeling when I found. Of course I was opposed to his way of thinking very much. On the same principle. I didn't like the inference he drew. But he reached this part of the truth all right. That if you begin to follow morality, you will ultimately be led to religion and God, and there is no gainsaying it. I am pointing to his book written against one of his co-workers, comrades of very high station in communist history. He thought that now that we have achieved the communist state, we will not be able to run it properly unless we also learn morality and teach morality. Because morality is highly essential for running any organization. He was quite right in his own way. But also was Lenin right when he said, all right, you fool, if you begin to follow morality, I assure you it will lead you to religion and God. Because you cannot define morality without the concept of God and without the concept of religion. So you will entirely destroy the very purpose of your revolution. And he wrote a book that thick, many 100 pages, I think it's more than 500 pages or so, and written in small print. And he gives reason after another reason, and serves this point home, that morality cannot exist without religion. And once you adopt morality, you are bound to be led towards religion. And he was quite right. But the inference which he drew was not employed correctly. He decided the wrong way. He said, all right, for the sake of preserving an irreligious philosophy, we must sacrifice morality. That decision became the ending of communism in Russia. That is true communism. And this is why China had to shift from that concept of communism without morality to a communism with morality, because willy-nilly they were led to it. And Mao Zedong started that movement. In all the books of Mao Zedong, you will find reference to morality so repeatedly and so intensely that at times you think some great saint or moral teacher is addressing you instead of a communist leader. Yet, as I explained, Lenin was also right. So, Mao Zedong had to pay the price of this morality through his nose in a different way. Chinese communists started turning towards Confucius and his teachings. And they said, oh, if this is what Marxism, Leninism means, then we have our own Marxist-Leninist in the form of Confucius. He taught these things, these higher standards of morality much earlier than you came. So Mao Zedong had repeatedly to launch movements against Confucianism as well. So he was caught in the hot and cold breath. One breath was hot and the other was cold. At one time he would lay stress on morality, at the other time he would start laying stress on anti-religious conduct and launch a campaign against Confucianism. That was exactly what Lenin had predicted. But both were right, but partly right, because they wanted to remain irreligious. So the truth they accepted, that I have explained in the terms of the Quranic values, that morality is absolute wisdom. If you don't follow morality as it should be followed in absolute terms and try to compromise part of it, then to that extent you will be unwise. And your plan is bound to be frustrated and fail. That is an illustration of how it did. He was right that morality would lead to religion, so he rejected morality. But the same rejection also destroyed the communism, its philosophy, its way of life. What you find in Russia today is a totalitarian society, all right, but not that communism which was the dream of Marx, that communism which was traveling towards a stateless society, traveling towards equality in every region. Instead, in their way of life, they have traveled a lot towards the Western way of life, and which is also irreligious, of course, but it's not communist either. And they cannot go back, because without morality, they cannot make the system function honestly. And if they become moral, they would become religious. That is the dilemma. They don't want to become religious, And with immorality, you cannot run any system honestly. Why to follow a system when your personal benefits lie in a different direction? Why not perpetuate your own rule? This is what Stalin did at the cost of millions of people. Because there was a real total immorality, the result was a real total cruelty and despotism. This is what is created in the opposite pole. If the lack of morality is partial, the crime or the criminal dispensation created would only be partial. If the lack of morality is complete, the criminal dispensation would also be complete. So despotism and cruelty as found in the communist dictatorship cannot be found anywhere in the world apart from communism or apart from atheism. If there is atheism in other places, yes, people can be extremely despot and cruel. But those who are wed to morality, even if they have partial link with morality, their crime would always remain partial. This is what I have been telling the Jamaat Ahmadiyya in Pakistan so many times, reminding them repeatedly, that the Muslims cannot become cruel beyond a certain point because they always will remain moral to some extent. You can't imagine how much a Hindu, an atheist can become a cruel, and a idolater can become a cruel. A Muslim, if he is cruel to that extent, write it down, take it for granted that that person is positively an atheist and is only deceiving you that he is a Muslim. He is a fraud. He is not a Muslim at all. True Muslims can become dictators, of course. Not true Muslims, but partial Muslims. But their despotism would also remain partial. So this is one illustration of how morality becomes religion and religion becomes morality and morality becomes absolute wisdom and absolute wisdom becomes morality. And the lack of them lead to a crime which is respectively intense. Intense in direct relationship to how far you have deviated from absolute morality.
Yes, sir. Now you have also mentioned the China in your talk and the way they are shifting now. Would you think they are shifting towards away from the communism because the
No, they are shifting from what is good in communism. They are not shifting from what is bad in communism. And that is also a direct result of immorality. If they were moral, or if they really required morality, they would shift from bad in communism towards what is good in communism. All this havoc is being played by the lack of morality, so naturally the choices are also corresponding choices. They are shifting from the good points of communism, that is, true dispensation of justice, true equality, regards for people's rights, and to see to it that nobody injures the feelings of others or the rights or tramples upon the rights of others, and everybody remains within the four walls of his own jurisdiction. This is a very good point of communism. But if attempted to be achieved with an immoral handle, it will never be achieved. Because the very concept of justice has a sense of morality in it. And through immorality you can never reach morality. But a part of communism is of course there. A sense of justice will always remain there because that is a must for the regimes to stay in power. If they totally run away from the system, the result would be that they would undo themselves. To remain seated in power requires complete regimentation. And a complete regimentation requires that philosophy which brought them into power. So it's impossible for them to run away from the philosophy of communism, because that is the system which they are riding. They would be extremely fools if they cut the very branch on which they are sitting, as we call it in Urdu. The branch on which you are sitting, you'd never cut. So the evil part, that by hook or by crook, you must maintain the party rule. And that party must be a much smaller party than the people. And you must rule the people with an iron fist and an iron hand. And yet, you must draw your power from the people and the masses, and you must not permit them to grow one beyond the other. Because the moment it begins to happen, then you will ultimately be overthrown. Because there will be power concentration in some hands, and power pockets would be created. I mean, there are so many things. I can't explain all these factors, but I know I can visualize them all together at once. But to explain all that is a very longish process. But the fact is, one conclusion is positive, that communists would never be able to be unfaithful to communism in entirety. Communism will never reach its ultimate goal because of immorality. But also because of immorality, it would be maintained to only that extent, or to all that extent where it is necessary for maintaining totalitarian dictatorial regimes over communist masses. That is highly essential, and this is what's going to happen. Unless through great upheaval of the world or through a longish process of reactions and accumulation of reactions against communist philosophy, which is a very, very long process. Something different happens after 1,000 years or so. But that is a far cry.
It is a different thing which I am going to ask, if you will permit me again. Did you have time to...
Now Mr. Bashir Hayat is getting very rested.
No, it's a very short one. Did you read the Times leader today?
No,
About the measure which General Ziaul Haq has taken. He concluded in the end, that's what I want to tell
Yes,
you.
please.
But the only difference, the measure he has taken by election and this and that, is only that he was a General Zia, but in future he will be President Zia.
Yes.
What he has concluded, and there will be no other difference.
That's very interesting, but that is what the Hindu press representative put him. That is the way the Hindu press representative put it to Zia himself.
Yes, I remember.
You know, exactly. I think he liked it so much that he quoted from him. He borrowed it from him. What he said to General Zia was this, that as I see things, you have transferred the powers from General Zia to the President Zia. That is all the change that has happened in Pakistan. Nothing else.
That is the whole leader.
But another joke, which was published surprisingly in a Pakistani paper, describes the situation in a very humorous way and very aptly, in a different way altogether. The joke is better enjoyed in Punjabi or Urdu, but anyway I will try to explain it in English. He says that a poor simpleton went to see a fair, a mela, for the first time in his life. So he was naturally excited. He bought a new cloth cover, chadar I mean, a sheet of cloth, and this is the custom in the Punjab. When you go to some very important place, some marriage, if the rest of the clothes are dirty, rotten, torn, and that doesn't make any difference. That covers must be new and good. So he bought a new sheet and went to see the Mela. So he was a simple person, he got engaged in observing this and that and lost caution. And some thug in the Mela ran away with his chadar, which he didn't notice at that time. So when he returned home, suddenly he noticed that the chadar is not here. He said, what a fool they are, those who organize the Mela. How foolish they are, those who organize the Mela. If they wanted my sheet, they could have asked me, I could have given them. Why to go through the headache of organizing all this Mela, calling so many people, having stalls and things, and making such hue and cry and noise about it? They could have come, the organizers, and asked me to give them my chadar, and I could have given them the chadar. So he said, this is exactly what General Zia has done about the referendum. Why this noise? Why this involvement of the entire government machinery and the people and the waste of money and time? What he wanted, he in fact had already. The chadar was already with him. Yes. Yes, please. Mubarak Salman Sahib. You are loan, aren't you? Loan?
Yes,
Mubarak loan. And there is another Mubarak loan sitting over here.
he's my next door neighbor.
Huh?
He's my next door neighbor in jail.
In jail? You are genuine? You are also genuine? Originally? Huh?
My parents, they are.
I see. Okay. Please.
Your Holiness is giving some khutbahs about Kartasi Abiyas,
Yes.
so-called white paper. Is it going to be combined in some kind of book in the later stage?
I think we could publish it as khutbah separately. Later on, if the needs be, we could also publish them in book form.
Because
But generally people can't read longish books, big books. Nowadays, the habit of reading is fast disappearing. So if you have just one sermon at one time and another at another time, you give to your friends, perhaps they are more likely to read them rather than to read them in a very voluminous book form.
we are giving to our friends these khutbahs, but they feel still thirsty when how it's going to be finished. There are so many questions. And it is
They would come ultimately to an end, inshallah.
No, it's going to be so long.
So what can I do? I mean, I can't have Juma every day.
No, I'm not talking in that way. The things which is they are accusing us for so many years, and
Now
now
already we have got the answers
Yeah, we have got the
in various books and literature in booklets and folios, etc.
Yes, yes,
We have got the answers.
that's absolutely right. But due to 1974, when they declare us non-Muslims,
Yes.
and it's a mockery of Parliament of Pakistan,
Yes,
when it wasn't allowed anything to come out.
I agree.
Then every parliament has got the right to keep all the records, wherever they are.
That is correct, but
But they are now.
how can I expedite my khutbahs? That is the point.
Yeah.
Come to that.
I was, as they had issued it, Kartasi Abiyas, I was thinking to be that when we are going to make up a different khutbahs,
Yes, we can publish them in the form of real Qadasi Abiyas, that's right.
if you just made one book, just as he made
No harm.
one big book, like he has made the white paper first against.
All right, inshallah, we'll do that.
Yeah,
Yes, no harm, no harm.
thank you very much.
Yes, please. I think you're too late now. Most unfortunate. Why didn't you raise your hand before? Why didn't you? I said, you are already too late. Why didn't you raise, why didn't you raise your hand before?
No, Hazur, Hazur mentioned,
Fine?
in the beginning, Hazur mentioned that I was here.
And I still believe you are here,
I just,
but why didn't you express your desire to speak? That is the point.
no, I smiled. Understand that
Yes, sir.
what is,
But when you smile, I understand. But when I tell you not to ask a question, you don't understand.
no, Hazur, I understand. Now, I can put away till tomorrow.
No, if you have a question with a small answer, please go ahead. Otherwise, you know, you won't be able to sleep tonight. Yes.
Hazur can shorten the answer. I had 4 questions today, but I start with first one. Would Hazur kindly explain how and when the movement of banning the Ahmadi Muslims for reciting and displaying the sacred kalima started, and which parts of the Muslim world were affected by this violation of basic human rights and denial of religious freedom?
Even recently, it all started with the mullahs of Pakistan and nowhere else. And not all the mullahs of Pakistan. The Deobandis and the so-called Jamaat Islami people, that's a clique. And the same clique, as I have been explaining and exposing them, the same clique which has always been employed by foreign masters, by imperialist powers and also by Indians sometimes.
When you refer to the Deobandis, mean also in India Deobandis?
Yes, the same people,
No. Or all of them are against?
all of them.
Because I must be here, when I traveled to Deobandi, seems to be condemning what was happening against the Ahmadis.
No, but the fact is that they are not now being employed as Majlis-e-Ihrar. Basically, they have the same views and they are opposed to Ahmadiyyat very strongly on the same lines. But if they are paid for launching a movement, they will do, otherwise not. Why should they? Because Ahmadiyyat is not posing any problem. In fact, it is not posing any problem anywhere. But in India, it's such a small entity that they don't have a need for employing any Maulvis against Ahmadis there in India. In fact, it will only create problems for themselves. So, they are not paid. And whenever the Maulvis are not paid, they don't work. Yes. That is the only difference. They don't even go against us to jalsas. You know, I know one case which happened near Rabwa. There was a place where the Ahmadis started preaching and there was a commotion caused by that preaching. And some people went to a mullah who was extremely anti-Ahmadiyya. So they invited him and he said, how much you are going to pay me? He said, Maulvi Sahab, for God's sake, what are you talking? We'll give you moza and this and that, you know. We'll offer the best food and also the both-way passage. But he said, no. I must have the hourly payment for, 50 rupees I was told. It appears to be quite cheap, but that was the price. And the villager said no. And he said, all right, I'm not coming. So that is their extent of animosity towards Ahmadiyyat. Even that is pushed through the help of money. There in the market, anybody can buy them and employ them in any direction. In fact, we have been approached by certain mullahs so many times in Ahmadiyya history by offering their services for the purpose of diverting attention from Ahmadis in the direction of Barelvis or Sunnis or Wahhabis or whatever denominations they are, or Shiites, if we pay to them. Before coming over to England, I received a message from my cousin. Of course, they sent a message not as seriously, but only as a joke, that this is the real quality and character of the mullahs. I don't name the town, otherwise that person would also be exposed. So he approached my cousin and said that if you pay us some handsome amount, we guarantee anti-Wahhabi rioting in this area. And this is an undertaking. You pay that money to someone, have it deposited with the party whom both parties can trust, and we'll do that. So he said, of course. I told him off, said, shut up and do what you please. But he conveyed the message to me all the same. He said, this is what's happening, this is what they do to us. So if in Pakistan something is happening, it is because they are being paid, not without it.
Is there any difference between Wahhabi of Pakistan and Wahhabi of Saudi Arabia?
Yes, a lot of difference of character. The Arab Maulvi has a much higher character, though he is also very stiff, even more narrow-minded in his approach, but honestly so. He's built like that. He's very harsh and unforgiving, like all Wahhabis are, narrow-minded, of course, but not faithless, not dishonest. They are not in the market. You will never hear of Arab mullahs being in the market. They are true, honest people. Whichever they believe, they follow. And they lead their people to this. Is why they are respected there. But in our society, everybody knows the mullah, what he is worth.
Who should lead the prayer?
Huh?
They call themselves who should lead the prayer, and their followers call them clashes and all this. For petty matters.
Yes. Everything. If the money is involved, not otherwise. Yes, please. All right, that will be the last thing. Come on. Come on and tell us the Latifa, please. So we'll depart on a happy tone, happy note.
This is Latifa. In the time of our beloved Hazrat Maulana Nuruddin Abdul first, because he was very popular and most of the Maulvis were very, very obedient to him, getting advice from him.
You mean before he became an Ahmadi?
No, when he was an Ahmadi already.
But he was not qualified.
Qadian.
Huh?
He was living at then at Qadian.
But the non-Ahmadi mullahs were obedient to him?
Yeah.
Which mullah?
Just like mullah, just from villages like. And he came to him, you might have remembered when I started it. Yes, it is in the books.
Yes.
It's not from the only one.
Are you referring to Chedi Ji Darvia?
He just, made a nakah.
That I have already told in one of my khutbahs.
When he said he gave me
Yes.
1 rupee.
They know it, everybody.
That's it?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum.